In the very heart of Old Jerusalem was the temple. And in the heart of the temple, within the innermost sanctuary, was the Holy of Holies, where only the high priests were allowed to go on very rare and special and holy occasions. And in the heart of the Holy of Holies, separated by partitions and curtains, sat the Ark of the Covenant. And inside the Ark of the Covenant were the tablets of stone upon which were engraved the 10 Commandments, commandments which, if honored, would actualize a new community holding at its very heart and core life that would be lived in harmony with God and with neighbor. And in the heart of the ark was the throne of God, the seraphim, the mercy seat. The mercy seat was simply a slab of gold resting on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and guarding either end of the slab and made of one piece with it were the golden cherubim. Their faces turned inward toward each other, and their wings overarching the mercy seat. And here between the cherubim and over the mercy seat was the throne, the dwelling place of the Lord God of Israel. On the Day of Atonement, it was on this mercy seat that the chosen high priest would come and sprinkle the sacrificial blood. God's presence was nowhere portrayed within the Holy of Holies or anywhere else in the areas of the temple. All that greeted the high priest was a blank slab of empty space, an open place, the void, the great speaking absence, as one writer has put it. In other words, the most sacred space where God was in the midst of the Hebrew people was empty. What the Israelites carried with them all through the wilderness and what they protected with their very lives was a seat with nothing on it, but everything in it. To go to Jerusalem to visit God, to make a pilgrimage, to find mercy and comfort was to visit empty space. The holy absence, the holy silence, the holy space between the cherubim resting atop the foundation of 2 tablets of stone, which in essence described what life would be like if it really was all about relationships. And if it really was all about living in harmony with God and neighbor. It is exactly because there was no gilded statue, there was no talking idol, that the Israelites were able to experience the living, uncontrollable, uncontainable presence of God's holiness in their midst. If you can begin to capture this image and this experience of holy emptiness, then I think you can begin to understand more fully Jesus' rampage in the temple courts. As you may have noticed, our overarching theme throughout this Lenten season has been covenant. And we have had for each day a key word to relate to our covenant. We began with the rainbow as a sign of our covenant with God. Then last week, Matt preached a sermon about blessing that comes to us through covenant. Well, our word today is keep. Keeping covenant. And that is the very word that must have haunted Jesus as he walked through the courts of the temple, realizing that the people of God's deepest covenantal love, the people who had received sign after sign after sign, the people who had received blessing after blessing, flowing like a river out of the heart of God's grace. These beloved people could neither keep the commandments nor keep the silence. Or maybe a better way of thinking about it is they could not keep the commandments because they could not keep the silence, when in essence all of it was offered to them as a pathway toward life that could be lived in harmony with God and with neighbor. It was a pathway to the abundant life that Jesus kept trying to offer. Jesus' surprising actions were partly a reaction against the intrusion of unholy noise and unholy images into the sanctuary of holy silence. Jesus saw that the temple site was gradually being transformed from a center of spirituality that leads to greater silence and hence greater holiness. And it was becoming a place simply of greater and greater noise. The crush of crowds and commerce threatened to fill every nook and cranny of the holy absence. And not only was it the noise of legitimate commerce, it was the noise of oppression and manipulation as opportunists played off the needs of the poor and the visitor and the broken-hearted who hungered so deeply for time with God. In this space of all spaces, the beloved of God could keep neither the commandments nor the silence. All the while, God reaches out God's hands, weeping, trying to be heard, saying, "All I want for you is life. All I want for you is authentic life, life that I will keep for you wherever you go, life that will be kept as a blessing, life that will be kept for eternity, life that will be kept from falling." So the question I have for us this morning is, what kind of noise have we let into our temples in order to avoid listening to God? What kind of noise is preventing us from finding the mercy seat of help and healing and wholeness? Emperor Frederick was the emperor of the Roman Empire in the 13th century. And he thought it would be helpful and useful as an experiment to know what the original human language was, whether it was Greek or Latin or Hebrew, whatever. So he decided on an experiment. He decided to isolate a few infants from the sound of any human voice. And he reasoned that if so isolated from anything prejudicial, when they did speak, it would be the universal, natural language of the human species. So wet nurses were gathered to care for these babies, but they were sworn to absolute silence and could not engage in any kind of socialization with them from the moment these children were born. They never heard the sound or the hum or the song of a human being. And within a year, all of them were dead. We need to hear each other's voices. But we were also created to be in communication with one voice. We were created to be immersed in the language of God's love, and we must stop constantly filling our lives with all kinds of noise so that we can hear it. And truly, it is only when we hear the one voice that we can know fully how to hear the voices of one another. In our churches, in our families, in our work, in our communities, if our lives truly are going to be an expression of covenant keeping and an expression of life and life abundant that Jesus spoke of and promised, then we must clear out some space. We need to clear out some of the noise and begin to listen to the voice heard only in the speaking absence. Now, this made me begin to ponder about a phrase we hear so often this time of year. I have decided to give up something for Lent. And I remember having a conversation with a woman who was in one of my churches, and she said just hearing the word Lent made her go back in time to where she was a 12-year-old girl sitting in her Sunday school class with a very patient teacher who was an old woman of about 28. And this teacher asked the students to think about sacrifice and to think about what they would sacrifice for Lent. And they were to come back the next week and share with the class what they were going to give up for Lent. And as fate would have it, she was the first one called upon the next week. What are you going to sacrifice for Lent? And she said without hesitation, she said, watermelon juice. And she said without a giggle or a snicker, all of her friends in the class followed suit. And she said that two favorites from their sharing were baked kraut and cucumber seed. So what they were going to sacrifice was watermelon juice, cucumber seed, and kraut. Well, later I asked her to write about this experience and this watermelon stage of her faith. And this is what she wrote. Many years went by before I began to learn the true meaning of sacrifice. At the age of 50, a loved one's terminal illness required constant caregiving and a dedication I did not know I possessed. Looking back, I'm not sure how I survived, except through God's grace and ever-present comfort. I truly learned to live one day at a time. Strangely enough, it never felt like a sacrifice. It must have seemed so to my friends who made statements like, "I could never," and "Why do you keep him at home?" That is when I realized that sacrifice is just putting a part of one's life on hold and letting God take charge. I was on hold for 6 very long years, but in the end I felt such peace for my loved one and for myself. The struggle had made me a different person forever. She concluded her devotional with a prayer written by St. Francis de Sales. Do not look forward to what might happen tomorrow. Either God will shield you from suffering, or God will give you unfailing strength to bear it. What kind of noise might you be willing to give up for Lent so that you just might hear the voice of the one who promises to hold you and to keep you like that? What kind of noise might you give up for Lent so that you can hear the whisper of Christ saying, "This is my body that is broken for you because I love you. This is my blood poured out for you because I have claimed you as my very own." What kind of noise might you give up for Lent so that you might keep covenant and keep silence in such a way that God can be found on the mercy seat of your heart, all for the sake of your deeper peace and your deeper joy?